She discovered a handmade baby blanket was medical waste. So she reported it, cut contact, and forced real accountability. Margaret gently rocked her 7-month-old son, Noah, as she gazed out the window at the Boston skyline. The weight and warmth of this tiny life in her arms brought her a happiness that was beyond compare. "Noah, Mama will always protect you," she whispered. Working as a nurse in the pediatric department at Boston General Hospital, Margaret understood the weight of responsibility that came with having a child better than most. Her husband, Brian, was successful as an environmental consultant, and the peaceful home they had built together was Margaret's greatest treasure. She heard the sound of coffee brewing in the kitchen. Brian was preparing breakfast. He was a kind and thoughtful husband who had been actively involved in childcare since Noah was born. If there was one worry, though, it was his relationship with his family. "Margaret, my mother called," Brian said. "She wants to stop by this afternoon." Margaret sighed softly at Brian's words. His mother, Helen, was pleasant enough on the surface, claiming to enjoy making things by hand and constantly bringing gifts. However, her creations were always shoddy, sometimes completely unusable. Just last month, she had knitted a sweater for Noah that had sleeves of different lengths and a neck opening too tight to put on. "Diana is coming too," he added. Margaret's expression darkened further at the mention of Brian's sister. Diana affirmed everything her mother did and did not even try to hide her snide remarks toward Margaret. "It will be fine, Mom just wants some attention," Brian said, but Margaret knew it was not that simple. She sensed something intentional behind the smiles Helen and Diana showed. The way they treated Brian when she was not around was so different from how they behaved when she was present. At 3 in the afternoon, the intercom rang as expected. "Welcome, Helen, Diana." Margaret greeted them with as natural a smile as she could manage. Helen was dressed in expensive designer clothes. Diana, who had inherited her mother's good looks, wore perfect makeup and sophisticated clothing as usual. "Margaret, how have you been? Where is Noah?" Helen asked as soon as she entered. "He just woke up from his nap. He is in the living room." When they entered the living room, Helen's face lit up at the sight of Noah in Brian's arms. "Oh, my precious grandson, it is Grandma." Helen took Noah in her arms, acting as if he were her own child. Then she pulled a package from her large bag and handed it to Margaret with a proud expression. "It is a special baby blanket I worked really hard on. It is my hobby. I am sure you will like it." Margaret thanked her and opened the package. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary pastel blue blanket, but the texture was strange, with areas that felt oddly stiff, like soap residue. "It is a bit tacky, but it suits you perfectly," Diana said with a meaningful smile. In that moment, Margaret felt an indescribable unease about the glance exchanged between the sisters. However, to keep peace in the family, she expressed her gratitude. "Thank you, Helen. I will cherish it. Please do. It is a very special blanket." There seemed to be something hidden in Helen's words. Margaret picked up the blanket again and examined it closely. The stitching was sloppy, and there was a faint, distinctive odor. Brian tried to honor his mother's feelings by placing the blanket near Noah, but Margaret had already decided in her heart she would never use this blanket for her child. Margaret carefully folded the blanket from Helen and tucked it away in the back of her bedroom closet, hiding it under clothes she rarely wore. She had already prepared several soft, safe, organic cotton blankets for Noah. As a professional nurse, she was extremely careful about what she used for her baby. "I will just bring it out when Helen visits," she told herself. Over the next few weeks, Helen began visiting surprisingly often. She had developed a habit of asking the same question each time. "Are you using that blanket? Does Noah like it?" Margaret always gave vague answers, and occasionally brought out the blanket to show her. But as soon as Helen left, it went right back into the depths of the closet. She simply could not bring herself to use it for her baby. "Brian, I cannot understand why your mother is so fixated on that blanket," Margaret confided to her husband one day. "Mom just wants to feel like her creations are being used." "You are overthinking it," Brian replied, but Margaret was not convinced. A month later, on a Friday night, Margaret was working the night shift at the hospital. Brian was left to take care of Noah alone. Though not as meticulous as his wife, he was serious about his responsibilities as a father. In the middle of the night, Noah began to cry. Brian changed his diaper and gave him milk, but he would not stop crying. Brian gently picked up his son and walked around the living room, trying to soothe him. Suddenly, Noah moved vigorously and spit up on the blanket Brian had wrapped him in. Oops, it is okay, Noah. Brian calmed the baby and removed the soiled blanket, thinking he needed to replace it with a clean one. He searched the closet. He could not find any blankets on the shelf where Margaret usually kept them. As he continued searching, he found Helen's blanket hidden under some clothes. This will do, he thought, and wrapped Noah in it. Fortunately, Noah quickly calmed down and fell asleep. The next morning, when Margaret returned from her night shift, Brian was preparing breakfast in the kitchen. Noah was sleeping peacefully in his crib. "Good morning," Margaret kissed Brian. "How was last night?" "It was fine." He spit up a little, but no problem, Brian answered with a smile. "Oh, I need to wash the blanket Noah was using." Margaret went to check on Noah and smiled at the sight of her sleeping son. Then she casually glanced at the crib and noticed Helen's blanket. She gasped. "Brian, why did you use this blanket?" Brian turned around, surprised by Margaret's tone. "Noah spit up, so I replaced it with this one I found in the closet. Is there a problem?" Margaret took a deep breath, trying to regain her composure. "This is Helen's blanket. I have been keeping it away from Noah. Why?" "You need to consider Mom's feelings. I can feel it. There is something wrong with this blanket." Brian scratched his head. "You are overreacting. It looks normal enough." "Anyway, I will wash it." Margaret tried to stop him, but Brian had already taken the blanket to the laundry room. She was tired, so she decided to lie down for a while. Noah was sleeping safely, and washing the blanket should not be a problem, she thought. Several hours later, Margaret was awakened by a shout. "Margaret, look at this!" Brian's voice contained obvious distress. Margaret rushed to the living room where Brian stood trembling, holding the blanket spread out in his hands. Margaret froze when she saw the blanket. The blanket, discolored by water and heat, clearly revealed a hospital logo and symbols. The words biohazard, processed in red, and medical waste identification codes were clearly visible. This blanket was medical waste. It could contain hazardous substances. Margaret instantly understood. With her nurse's knowledge, Brian looked at his wife with disbelief. "What do you mean, did Mom deliberately?" Margaret quickly grabbed her cell phone and contacted her friend, a pediatrician. Although Noah had only been in direct contact with the blanket for a short time, tests were necessary just in case. "I need to take Noah to the hospital right away," Margaret said, her voice trembling. "You call Helen and ask her to explain what this is." Brian shook his head as he stared at the blanket. "I cannot believe it. Is Mom doing something like this?" Margaret picked up Noah, trying to stay as calm as possible, but inside her, flames of anger were rising. The pediatric outpatient department at Boston General Hospital was busy even on a Saturday afternoon. Margaret was embarrassed to face her colleagues, but she put her son's health first. Her friend, Dr. Carol, immediately escorted Noah to an examination room after hearing the situation. "It is going to be all right, Margaret. We will run tests right away," Carol said, maintaining both her professional coolness and the warmth of a friend. Margaret had dealt with many emergencies as a nurse, but when it was her own child in danger, it was difficult to maintain professional composure. She tried to hide her trembling hands as she watched Noah laughing on the examination table. "It is good the contact time was short," Carol said as she looked at the test results. "There are no symptoms at this point. We have done blood tests as a precaution, but the results will not be back until tomorrow. We need to know more about the materials and processing of that blanket." Margaret sighed with relief. "Thank you, Carol. I am so sorry about this, on a Saturday." "What are you saying?" "This is a serious matter," Carol frowned. "Where did that blanket come from? A gift from my mother-in-law." "You are kidding." Carol's eyes widened. "She deliberately gave you something like this?" At that moment, Margaret's phone rang. It was Brian. "Margaret, I called Mom." Brian's voice was shaking with anger and confusion. "I cannot believe it. She says it was just a joke. Don't be so angry. I do not understand what kind of joke this is supposed to be." Margaret closed her eyes and took a deep breath. "Noah seems okay for now. We are waiting for the blood test results. Brian, this is not just meanness. It could be a legal issue." "I know," determination was evident in Brian's voice. "I am heading to Mom's house now. I will talk to her directly." After hanging up, Margaret explained the situation to Carol, who immediately took action. "Margaret, we need to submit that blanket to the hospital's safety management department. Misappropriation of medical waste is a serious issue." Margaret nodded. "I want to investigate too." Helen used to work as a nursing assistant at a different hospital. With Carol's help, Margaret submitted the blanket in a sample bag to the hospital's safety management department. Then she accessed the hospital database and began researching the medical waste identification codes. Her colleague, Jessica, came over to help. "This code is from Maine General Medical Center," Jessica said. "It is a disposal label from about 2 years ago. You might get more detailed information if you contact that hospital." Margaret remembered that her mother-in-law had once worked at Maine General Medical Center. The puzzle pieces were starting to fit together. Meanwhile, Brian had parked in front of Helen's house. Diana's car was there too. He knocked on the door, trying to control his anger. "Brian, what is going on? Why such a fuss?" Helen opened the door, pretending as if she knew nothing. "Stop pretending, Mom," Brian said, his voice shaking. That blanket. When we washed it, medical waste markings appeared. Why would you give something like that to a baby?" "Well, come in. The neighbors will hear you," Helen ushered her son inside. In the living room, Diana was sitting on the sofa polishing her nails. She gave Brian a small smile when she saw him. "You are overreacting. It is just a blanket." "Just a blanket?" Brian looked incredulous. "It might contain hazardous substances. Noah is at the hospital being tested right now." "If it is so dangerous, the hospital should manage it better," Helen coldly retorted. "Besides, your wife always acts like the expert. I just wanted to give her a bit of trouble." "That is right," Diana joined in. It was annoying how Margaret always says, "as a nurse." We were betting whether she would notice. Brian was speechless. He could not believe what he was hearing from his mother and sister. "So, you put a baby's health at risk? Your own grandson?" "You are overreacting." Helen waved her hand. "It was just a prank. It is not dangerous. Hospitals clean used items before disposal." "But why would you do such a thing?" Brian held his head. "I worked as a nursing assistant for 20 years, Helen said proudly. "I did not like that Margaret did not respect my experience. She is always talking about the latest childcare methods and ignoring my advice. And she does not use my handmade items, does she? I know she hid them in the closet." Hearing those words, Brian recalled childhood memories. His mother had always liked pranks. She regularly played small tricks on people she did not like. He had always turned a blind eye. "Mom, this is not just a prank," he said sternly. "Margaret has an obligation to report this to the hospital. It could become a legal issue." The color drained from Helen's face. "What? Unauthorized removal of medical waste is a crime, especially if it potentially contains hazardous materials." "Wait a minute," Diana interrupted. "Are you going to report your own mother? You are being manipulated by Margaret." Brian stared at his sister. "This is about Noah's safety. You do not understand the gravity of what you have done. Margaret is now investigating where that blanket came from. Maine General Medical Center, right?" Helen collapsed into a chair. "I just wanted to—" "What? What did you want to do?" Brian pressed. "I wanted to get back at Margaret." Helen suddenly began crying. "Because she thinks she is a better mother than me, rejecting my parenting methods. So you put a baby at risk." Brian could not contain his anger. The phone rang. It was Margaret. "Brian, I have got confirmation." Her voice was calm, but he could tell there was tension underneath. "That blanket is definitely medical waste from Maine General Medical Center. It might have belonged to an infectious disease patient. We are waiting for the blood test results, but the Safety Management Department is taking this situation very seriously." Brian looked at his mother. Helen covered her face with both hands, her shoulders shaking. "I understand," he answered the phone. "I am coming home now. Let us figure out how to handle this together." After hanging up, Brian was silent for a long time. Finally, he said, "Mom, I am going to protect Margaret and my son. You will have to take responsibility for your actions." He left his mother's house. In the car, he gripped the steering wheel tightly. He blamed himself for turning a blind eye to his mother's behavior all this time. He should have noticed sooner. Margaret's intuition had been right. The living room of Margaret and Brian's home was filled with unusual tension the following afternoon. Official hospital test documents lay on the table, and the two sat side by side on the sofa. Noah was being looked after by a friend in another room. Fortunately, the blood tests came back negative. "Noah is safe," Margaret said quietly, "but low concentrations of formaldehyde and traces of blood components were detected in the blanket. Regular follow-up will be necessary." Brian sighed deeply. What was Mom thinking? She was not thinking, Margaret said bitterly. She does not understand the seriousness of what she did. The doorbell rang and Brian stood up. He welcomed attorney Jennifer Cohen. "I am sorry to meet you both under such difficult circumstances," Attorney Cohen said with a serious expression. "Let me review the situation once more." While Margaret explained everything, Attorney Cohen took careful notes. When the story was finished, she reviewed the documents and then looked up. "There are two separate issues involved here," she explained. "One is a civil matter, the fact that your child was put at risk. The other is a criminal matter, the unauthorized removal of medical waste. Maine General Medical Center is taking this situation very seriously." "What are our legal options?" Margaret asked. "The hospital has already begun a formal investigation. If there is evidence that Helen deliberately removed medical waste, there could be criminal charges. You, as victims, need to decide whether to press charges." Brian frowned. "I do not want to put my mother in jail. I just want her to take responsibility." "I understand," Attorney Cohen replied gently. "Apart from legal options, think about what you want to achieve." While they were talking, a cell phone rang. The screen showed Helen. Brian hesitated for a moment but answered. "Brian?" Helen's voice sounded smaller than usual. "I have called the whole family. Could you come to the house this evening? I want to explain." Brian looked at Margaret and Attorney Cohen. They both nodded slightly. "All right, I will come at 5 p.m. Margaret and Brian arrived at Helen's house. Several cars were parked outside, showing that the extended family had gathered. For safety, Noah had been left with Margaret's parents. "Are you okay?" Margaret squeezed Brian's hand. "Yes," he answered with a determined expression. "Let us face this together." In the living room, Brian's aunt and uncle, several cousins, and Helen's sister, Martha, had gathered. Helen and Diana were in the corner of the room, looking anxious. "Thank you all for coming," Helen said in a weak voice. "I wanted to explain what I did." She began explaining yesterday's event in her own way. However, her explanation distorted reality, making it sound as if a harmless prank had been misunderstood. "Wait," Margaret stood up. "We should present the facts accurately." With the coolness and clarity of a nurse, she explained everything that had happened, the nature of medical waste, the dangers it posed, and the potential effects on a baby. As she explained, she pulled the hospital test results from her pocket. "This is not just meanness. It is misappropriation of medical waste, and Noah's life could have been at risk." The room fell silent. Helen's sister Martha was the first to speak. "Helen, is this true?" Helen did not answer and lowered her gaze. Diana stood up to protest, but Martha stopped her with a hand. "Helen, this is not the first time you have done something like this," Martha said slowly. "Maybe it is time to tell the family." The atmosphere in the room changed. Brian looked at his mother's sister with curiosity. "What do you mean?" Martha took a deep breath. "Helen has always had this pattern of behavior, pranks on people she does not like. At first, they were harmless, but they escalated over time." She slowly began to tell several past episodes, the real reason Helen's ex-husband, Brian's father, decided to divorce, troubles at multiple workplaces, and several strange coincidences that had been rumored among relatives. "Your father left because of her behavior," Martha said to Brian. "Because no one tried to confront the issue head-on, the problems only got worse." Brian collapsed into a chair, shocked. In his memory, his father had abandoned the family because work was too busy. "Why did not anyone tell me?" he asked, his voice trembling. "We were trying to protect Helen," Martha answered sadly, "but now I think that was a mistake." Helen began to cry. "I just wanted attention." Margaret addressed everyone in the room. "This is not a personal conflict. As a healthcare professional, I had an obligation to report this. Maine General Medical Center has already begun an investigation." Helen looked up. "Are you going to have me arrested?" "That is not for us to decide," Margaret answered calmly. "However, I would like to propose one solution." She explained the conditions she and Brian had discussed. Helen would need to undergo professional counseling and seriously commit to treatment. Contact with Noah would be limited until progress was made, and she would formally apologize to the medical center for her actions and cooperate with any legal measures. "I think that is the best solution," Margaret said. "The goal is not punishment, but genuinely resolving this issue." Brian stood up and faced his mother. "Mom, I have been turning a blind eye all this time." I did not believe Margaret's intuition. I sincerely apologize for that, he said to Margaret. Then he turned back to his mother. But now, my son's safety comes first. Unless you get treatment and genuinely try to change, I cannot let you see Noah. This is a non-negotiable condition. After a long silence, Helen answered in a small voice. I understand. Diana sat next to her mother, her expression softening for the first time. I was wrong too, Margaret. I am truly sorry. That night, in the car returning home, Margaret and Brian were silent for a long time. Thank you, Brian finally said. You handled this professionally, and you gave my mother a chance to change. Families are complicated, Margaret smiled with a tired expression, but we have taken the first step. The real challenge begins now. Forgiveness is not easy, but in their hearts, they believed that understanding and responsibility could open the path to true healing. Noah, look at Mama, say cheese! Margaret called to her son, who was wearing a blue and white hat, as she held the camera. Noah was celebrating his second birthday, and the backyard was decorated with a small tent and colorful balloons. The spring day in Boston was mild, with flowers beginning to bloom. The cake is ready. Brian came out from the kitchen, carrying a cake shaped like a blue dinosaur. A happy smile played on his face. The past year had been a time of change and growth for Margaret and Brian's family. A few months after the incident, they learned they were expecting their second child. Margaret's pregnant belly was now rounded, filled with the family's expectations for the new life. Guests are here, Margaret said. Noticing the sound of the intercom, Margaret's parents appeared at the door. Along with Helen, who had a tense expression beside her, stood Caitlin, a social worker. Hello, everyone, Margaret greeted them calmly. Helen approached hesitantly, holding a small package. Over the past year, she had attended therapy twice a week, learning about anger management and building healthy relationships. Her contact with the family had been restricted, and she was only allowed to see Noah under supervision. Happy birthday, Noah, Helen said gently. Her voice no longer had the domineering tone it once had. This is a present from Grandma. Brian took the package from his mother, carefully checked the contents, and then gave it to Noah. Inside was a handmade stuffed animal, a small bear made with soft cotton and safe materials. Did you make this yourself? Brian asked, looking surprised. Yes, I learned in a craft class, Helen answered shyly. This time it is truly handmade. I used only safe materials. Diana, who arrived in the garden later, had also changed. Instead of flashy makeup and expensive clothes, she wore a simple dress, and her previous hostility toward Margaret had disappeared. Margaret? Diana called hesitantly. Let me know if there is anything I can help with. As the party progressed, Margaret stood in the corner of the garden, observing her family. Brian had grown as a father and had developed his own strong opinions. Helen, though still not perfect, was gradually changing through counseling. Diana had begun to become emotionally independent from her mother and had moved to her own apartment. Lost in thought, turning around, she saw Brian standing there with a gentle smile. Just thinking about how much has changed in the past year, Margaret answered. Mom is really trying, Brian said, watching Helen playing with Noah under Caitlin's supervision across the garden. It will take time to trust her completely, though. People can change, Margaret said quietly, but it is up to each individual to choose that change. That is right. Brian put his arm around his wife's shoulder. If you had not handled it calmly that day, we might not be here today. Margaret smiled. I responded not just as a nurse, but as a human being. A person's true value lies in the courage to acknowledge mistakes and try to change. As dusk approached, the entire family gathered around the table to celebrate Noah's birthday. Repairing damaged relationships is a long journey, but this day symbolized a new beginning. Margaret placed her hand on her belly, feeling hope for the future. She knew that while family shapes are not perfect, with understanding and forgiveness, new bonds can form. The blanket was still kept in the hospital's safety management department, but ironically, the changes it brought had woven new threads into their lives. Margaret stood in the quiet of the nursery, watching Noah sleep peacefully in his crib 2 years after the incident that had shaken their family to its core. The soft rise and fall of his chest brought a familiar wave of gratitude, but now it was laced with a deeper, hard-earned peace. She placed a gentle hand on her rounded belly, feeling the faint flutter of their second child, a quiet reminder that life, fragile as it was, had continued to bloom despite the darkness they had faced. Reflecting on that terrifying Saturday morning when the washed blanket revealed its true nature, Margaret felt a chill even now. The shock had been immediate and visceral, the biohazard markings staring back at her like an accusation. In that moment, fear for Noah's life had gripped her heart so tightly she could barely breathe. As a nurse, she knew the risks all too well. Possible exposure to formaldehyde, blood-borne pathogens, residues that no child should ever encounter. Yet beneath the fear burned a fierce, protective anger. Someone had deliberately placed her baby in danger, and that someone was family. The days that followed were a storm of emotions. There was betrayal, sharp and cutting, when Brian relayed Helen's casual dismissal of it as just a joke. Margaret had felt isolated at first, wondering if her instincts had been dismissed too easily. But watching Brian confront his mother, hearing the tremor in his voice as childhood illusions shattered, deepened her empathy for him. He too was grieving. The loss of the mother he thought he knew, the guilt of having overlooked warning signs for years. Anger gave way to resolve. Reporting the blanket was never a choice, it was a duty, both professional and maternal. Margaret felt no triumph in exposing Helen's actions, only a heavy sadness that it had come to this. Yet she refused to let resentment poison her heart. When they set boundaries, no contact until real change occurred, she did it not out of vengeance but out of love. Love for Noah, for the unborn child, and even, in a complicated way, for the family that might still heal. The family meeting had been the hardest, speaking calmly while relatives listened, laying out cold facts amid Helen's tears and Diana's defensiveness. Margaret had felt the weight of every word. She had trembled inside, but her voice stayed steady. In that room she chose clarity over chaos, accountability over silence, and when she proposed counseling instead of immediate legal punishment, it came from a place of weary hope that people could grow beyond their worst impulses. Over the following year, Margaret watched the slow, painful progress with cautious optimism. Helen's supervised visits, the shy offering of a truly safe handmade gift at Noah's second birthday, these small steps stirred a tentative warmth in her chest. Forgiveness was not a single moment, but a series of quiet decisions. To greet Helen without coldness, to allow supervised closeness, to believe that change, however imperfect, was possible. Now, standing in the nursery glow, Margaret felt a profound sense of closure, mingled with ongoing vigilance. The ordeal had tested her strength, exposed cracks in relationships she once took for granted, and ultimately forged something stronger. She had protected her son not just by reporting danger, but by insisting on truth and healing. In doing so, she had reclaimed her family on her own terms, rooted in safety, respect, and the courage to demand better. "Noah," she whispered into the stillness, "Mama will always protect you, and I'll keep choosing the hard path if it means keeping you safe." A soft smile touched her lips as she turned off the light. The past had scarred them, but it had also illuminated the way forward, brighter, wiser, and bound by threads far stronger than any blanket could ever be.